Everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target, also known as the SMART program. This webinar is a presentation of the RPS Collaborative, which is a project of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. On the line today we have Warren Leon, who will be moderating this webinar. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA, and he also manages the RPS Collaborative. And we also have with us Kaitlin Kelly from the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. Before I pass it over to Warren and Kaitlin, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. There we go. So on your screen today, you see a screenshot of your webinar console, which you should see in the upper right-hand corner of your computer desktop. The little red button there that you see circled, that will allow you to minimize your control panel if you'd like to see the webinar presentations in full screen. You'll also note that the audio panel is circled in red. You have a couple of options for joining the audio portion of this webinar. You're listening in your computer speaker system by default, but if you would prefer to join in over the telephone, you just select telephone and you'll be given dial-in information. A very important note, we ask that everyone please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question panel on the webinar console and hit send. We'll be reading through your questions as they come in, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of our presentation. We'll be reading through them as they come in. Type your question in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. That'll just make sure that you have a better chance of getting your question answered. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email probably later today with a link to the webinar recording and the slides, and we will also post them on our website where you can find archives of all of our previous webinars. So that web address is cesa.org/webinars. So with that out of the way, I would like to pass it over to Warren Leon.
Thank you very much, Samantha. For those of you on the line who aren't familiar with us, the Clean Energy States Alliance is a national membership organization composed primarily of state agencies, but also some other public agencies as well from across the country. We have members in 17 states, and we work with our members to advance clean energy in a variety of ways. If you want to know more, go to our website, www.cesa.org. You can see logos of our members on your screen. And if we go to the next slide, one of the things we do is manage the RPS Collaborative for the U.S. Department of Energy and the Energy Foundation. And this is a information exchange venue for state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and anyone else who's interested in the wonderful world of RPSs. We do webinars like the one today. We have a free monthly newsletter that talks about what's going on related to RPSs around the country, and we do an annual summit meeting in the fall in Washington, D.C. And if we could go to the next slide, one of the things we like to do to keep people up to date on what's going on with RPSs is to do webinars when a state is doing something new, different, and important. Excuse me. And Massachusetts has been very successful in adjusting its RPS and its RPS Solar Carve-Out and Solar REC program over time to take steps to try to minimize costs while continuing to have robust solar growth in the state. And we're going to hear today about the latest iteration in their evolving program, which is an very interesting and important event, and we're going to be hearing from Kaitlin Kelly, who's the RPS Program Coordinator at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, or DOER, and she's responsible for the management and administration of DOER's solar incentive programs under the state RPS. She joined DOER in 2014 after working previously in the government and nonprofit sectors. Prior to joining DOER, Kaitlin worked for the nonprofit organization A Better City and also spent a number of years working for Massachusetts State Senator Stan Rosenberg on constituent services. She holds an MA degree in Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning from Tufts University. And I will turn things over to Kaitlin with the reminder to everybody, if you think of questions, type them in at that time, and I will be developing a queue of questions to ask Kaitlin after her presentation. So Kaitlin, you're on.
Thank you, Warren. Good afternoon, everybody. And today I'm just going to go over the current design of the SMART program and our plans and next steps for implementing this program in Massachusetts. So first, some basic features of the SMART program. The SMART program is going to be a 1,600 megawatt AC declining block program. It will apply to all electric distribution companies in Massachusetts, so the investor-owned utilities. This program won't apply to municipal light plants. The same compensation rate will apply across the entire state, and will offer 10 or 20-year fixed price terms depending on the project capacity. So we'll have a 10-year tariff for small projects, 25 kW and under, and then 20-year projects for 25 kW to 5 megawatts. The compensation structure differentiates between size to load systems and standalone systems, and the base compensation rate will be set according to project size. We'll also be including adders based on location and projects that provide unique benefits, such as community solar, low-income projects, public projects, and energy storage. The base compensation rates will decline by set percentages in each block following Block 1, and the maximum project size to be eligible for this program is 5 megawatts per parcel. So just an overview of how this compares to our current incentive program for solar, the Solar Carve-Out program, which offers SRECs. So SRECs are a tradable commodity with a value that fluctuates based on market conditions. So because it's a market-based incentive, long-term revenue uncertainty leads to higher financing costs, and a large portion of the program costs are going to a third party to pay for financing. The total program cost and ratepayer impact independent of the value of energy, so they're only for with the solar power. Under the SMART program, the declining block program, we're providing long-term revenue certainty, which will reduce financing risks and in turn lower, because the total program cost, the certainty incentives will apply the declining cost of solar. So under the SMART facility, compensation rate, the energy value, the incentive value given to the generator. The resulting value is the net difference between the all-in rate and the value of the energy, and that's the actual amount that a generator will receive as an incentive payment. Some additional program features, the initial compensation rates will be set through a competitive procurement that will basically start the program, and that's going to be for projects from 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts. So it's for projects over a megawatt. And then we're going to use the results of that procurement to set the capacity-based compensation rates for the rest of the program for projects 1 megawatt or less. Projects eligible for the incentive may elect to receive compensation for the energy through one of three mechanisms. So net metering, which is an established way to receive value for your energy. Qualifying through an additional on-bill crediting mechanism, which I'll get into further, and then also a buy-all, sell-all rate for standalone facilities. So these would be essentially qualifying facilities that are just receiving the incentive payment. And again, I'll get into these categories in detail later on. The additional on-bill crediting mechanism is a new option, and we are creating it as an additional option to net metering. Some additional program facilities include having a difference between standalone and behind-the-meter systems. So we will have those incentive values calculated with different methodologies. The program will do more to steer projects toward optimal locations by providing location-based incentives. And we're also going to be providing disincentives for greenfield projects. So a greenfield subtractor will be applied to the base compensation rate of any facility sited on open space that doesn't meet certain criteria. And also, energy storage will become variable adder that's based on the ratio of the storage capacity to solar capacity, as well as the duration of the storage. And we will have some minimum performance standards to apply to the energy storage adder. So just a quick overview of the project categories that will be qualified under the SMART program. We have categories based on size, so less than 25 kW AC, also less than 25 kW AC specifically for low-income properties. Then we have a 25 to 25 kW, 25 to 250, 250 to 500, 500 to megawatt, and then we're going to have a competitive procurement with two different rates, a 1 to 2 megawatt size and a 2 to 5 megawatt size. Then we're going to have adders for different project types. So we have adders based on a project's location. So if it's on a brownfield, if it's on a landfill, if it's on a building, or if it's a solar canopy. And we also have adders based on who the off-taker of the power is. So community shared solar, low-income community shared solar, low-income property owners, and public projects. And then finally, we have our solar plus storage adder. So unlike SREC 2, adders can be combined together from different categories, from the location and the off-taker and the storage, to encourage optimal siting and also further policy goals. And like the blocks, all the capacity base rates in the adders will decrease by 4%. The initial competitive procurement is how we're going to set the prices for the entire program. So we'll commence with a competitive procurement of 100 megawatts of the first 200 megawatt block. And this will be for projects larger than a megawatt. Bids will be exclusively for the capacity-based compensation rate that a project wishes to receive. So it will not be inclusive of adders, and we may actually not allow projects that are seeking adders to bid into the competitive procurement. Currently, we've established two ceiling prices, a 15-cent price for projects between 1 and 2 megawatts, and a 14-cent price for projects 2 to 5 megawatts. And then each electric distribution company will procure an amount of capacity equal to the proportion of their distribution load. So essentially, it's going to be Eversource and National Grid procuring the majority, about half, 45% each, and then Unitil will procure the rest. And projects will be ranked within each subcategory from lowest to highest. After the project ranking has been determined, a statewide clearing price for each subcategory which will be established, which will be equal to a weighted average of all the clearing prices. So how it's going to work is each utility company will have a procurement. The price given to all the projects that get into and win the bid in the procurement will be set through a clearing price. And then the statewide price will be established based on a weighted average of those three clearing prices. Then we're going to use indices to establish the capacity base rate compensations for all of the project size categories in Block 1, and will be based on the clearing prices. For projects larger than 1 megawatt not selected through the procurement process, they'll immediately fall into Block 2, which will be 4% less than the clearing price, the average clearing price that we establish. And then compensation provided to projects selected through this process shall be proportionally paid for by the distribution companies. So that's each distribution company doing their own procurement for a proportional share of the load. So this is our current indices for each size category. So basically how this is set is if the clearing price for the 1 to 2, if the average clearing price for 1 to 2 megawatts is 15 cents, then that will be the price set for the 1 to 2 megawatt size category in Block 1, and then the indices against that price will set the prices for the rest of the sizes. So this is just an example of what those prices would be. So if we have a 15-cent price as a result of the procurement for 1 to 2 megawatts, that would result in a 30-cent price for 25 kW or less. And then these are the adder values that we will be offering in Block 1 for different types of projects. So you can see they vary according to where a project is located and who is the off-taker of a project. And all of these adders will decline by 4% per capacity block. And the solar plus storage adder is a variable adder that I'll get into more detail in later. So another way that we're differentiating projects and how they're being compensated under this program is whether a project is a standalone project or a behind-the-meter project. So a standalone is sort of your classic virtually net meter project where there's no associated load other than parasitic or station load. So a standalone facility net metered or approved under a similar DPU structure under the alternative on-bill credit structure will have its incentive calculated by subtracting the value of the energy it generates from its all-in compensation rate. And a standalone facility that is not net metered or approved under the alternative on-bill credit must be qualified as a qualifying facility, and they will then receive a single payment from the utility that's equal to its all-in compensation rate. So that is essentially just one payment for energy capacity and the incentive. So this will result in the value of the incentive changing over time as energy value increases or decreases. It's not the all-in compensation rate that's changing, but it's just what proportion of that all-in value is made up of a cash incentive payment versus a credited energy value. And then behind the meter facilities will be any facility that does not meet the definition of standalone. So if you're serving any on-site load, you will be a behind the meter facility. And a behind the meter facility will have a fixed incentive payment value that's determined at the time it's interconnected. So this is how behind the meter facilities will have their incentive calculated. Essentially, we look at the project, we determine what its all-in base compensation rate is, and then we subtract out the 3-year average of the retail service for the delivery rate at whatever customer class that project is connected at. So, for instance, if you have a 10 kW facility qualified under Block 1 at 30 cents, and it's interconnected behind the meter on the R1 rate class. So if you look at the 3-year average of the volumetric distribution, transmission, transition, and basic service, and that's determined to be 18 cents, the incentive rate would be set at 12 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's a fixed incentive payment for every kilowatt hour of solar production for 10 years. So this is an example of how a 20-year medium-sized system would receive payments for the term of the incentive. So basically the red is the incentive and the blue is the energy value. So if they're receiving net metering credits, that's indicated in blue on this chart, and the red is the actual cash incentive payment. So they're always getting the all-in rate is always the same. And actually, if energy values go higher than what their base compensation rate is determined to be, then they would still receive that as an on-bill credit and the value of that energy, but they wouldn't receive any additional incentive payment. And this is just an example of how a behind-the-meter generator would receive its incentive. So we determine what the fixed value of the incentive payment is at the beginning of its term, and even if energy values go up, it will always receive an amount equivalent to that fixed price that's determined at the very first time that it receives its incentive. So this is an example of how the capacity blocks will be allocated between the electric distribution companies. So, and we'll be basing it on the most recent load data that we have. So this is currently based on 2015 load. Mass Electric had 45.3% of the share, NSTAR had 45.6, OMECO had 7.7, et cetera. So under the initial competitive procurement for 100 megawatts, then essentially if you have 100 megawatts, grid is going to be procuring 45.3 megawatts, NSTAR is going to be procuring 45.6, et cetera. And all of the distribution companies will have 8 blocks, 8 200 megawatt blocks with a 4% decrease between the blocks. If you look at this, you can see that according to load share, Unitil and Nantucket they'll have very small blocks. So they could actually have fewer blocks. For example, 4 blocks with an 8% decrease in between blocks, or 2 blocks with a 16%. So, you know, the total share for Nantucket may only be 5 megawatts for the program. And then for that, they may choose to have only 2 blocks that decrease accordingly. We can also, all the blocks will also have a minimum of 20% reserved for projects 25 kW or less. So just kind of your small projects, that's mostly your residential installations. And we may consider a maximum amounts for certain types of projects, just maximum amounts of projects per block that may qualify. So this is, again, just illustrative of the block capacity allotments. So again, like I said, under the procurement, National Grid or Mass Electric has 45.3 megawatts. Under Block 1, they would then have 27.2, and then going through the rest of the program. And again, you can just see how you can break it up. So Unitil, even though, because they have a smaller share of the load and therefore a smaller share of capacity to allocate to projects, they may elect to have fewer blocks so that each of the blocks is a little bit bigger than what it might have been with 8 declining blocks. So one of the things we're going to have with the SMART program is a third-party Solar Program Administrator. So the administrator may be responsible for a number of tasks such as reviewing applications, qualifying facilities, managing the block reservations, determining the total amount to be paid or credited to the facility owner and off-takers each month. They may issue incentive payments to owners on behalf of the distribution companies, and they will likely be acting as the NEPL GIS independent verifier for all eligible systems. So the administrator would contract with the distribution companies, but DOER would have oversight of them. We're aiming to issue the RFP for the administrator shortly after we file the emergency regulation, and we're aiming to have a single entity selected, which may or may not have some subcontractors for different tasks. So right now, the proposed schedule, which is subject to change, is that after we file the emergency regulation, within 60 business days, the distribution companies issue an RFP for the third-party administrator, which will be open for 30 days. The distribution company will make a recommendation within 15 business days, and then we'll make the final selection 10 business days after that. So they have to be capable of executing all required responsibilities within a time period following their selection date by DOER. And we'll essentially be working with the distribution companies on developing that RFP. One of the major changes under the SMART program that we didn't have under the SREC 2 program is focusing on land use. So our original proposal on land use that we presented last September would have precluded significant portions of the state from receiving incentives for ground-mounted projects, and it relied heavily on GIS data layers. So under our revised proposal, we have exclusions from incentives for far fewer areas. We're excluding a small proportion of the area, but we're also disincentivizing based on broader criteria. So under this current proposal, ground-mounted projects larger than 500 kW and that are not sited on a brownfield or landfill and are on land that has not been previously developed will be subject to a subtractor per kilowatt hour that changes based on the number of acres impacted. And we'll be defining the number of acres impacted by looking at the literal footprint of the project. So what is the footage, the square footage of the number of panels that you are installing in your project? And that's how we'll be defining the area impacted and measuring that. And then all ground-mounted projects will also be subject to a set of performance standards that we've developed in consultation with the Department of Agricultural Resources. So as you can see, if you have a project that qualifies, you start at your base rate. And all projects, you know, if you're not on a brownfield or landfill, you can still qualify for off-taker adders. But if you are our ground-mounted project that is zoned for commercial and industrial use or for solar, but it's not previously developed, you'll get a small subtractor per acre. And then if you are located on, if you're a ground-mounted project that's not zoned for C&I or solar, then you'll get a higher subtractor. So again, this is just going over the different categories for land use and which types of projects would get the full greenfield subtractor or which projects would get the half greenfield subtractor. So if you are located on land that is previously developed, zone C&I or zone for solar, then you don't get any subtractor from your base incentive and then any applicable adders. If you're located on land that's determined to be a brownfield or landfill, or you're building a canopy on a parking lot or a rooftop, you won't get any subtractor. And then also, if you're located on land and agricultural use or prime ag land sized to meet no greater than 200% of the annual operation load, even if you're a non-canopy project, you also would not get a subtractor. So that's for land really that have APR. And then if you are located on land that is zoned for C&I or zoned for solar but hasn't been previously developed, you get the half greenfield subtractor. And then if you are on land that's not zoned for C&I and also not zoned for solar, you get the full greenfield subtractor. But again, with all these projects, if you go for an off-taker based adder or some other type of adder such as storage, you would still be able to apply that. The land use performance standards that we have developed in consultation with the Department of Agricultural Resources include no stripping of soils. For ground-mounted systems, we would like you to use ballast or screw-type pilings that don't require footings or other permanent penetration of the soils. For agricultural integrated systems using canopies, so for those ag canopy systems, any soil penetration that may be required for providing system foundations shall do so with minimal soil disturbance, and any displaced soils should be temporary and recovered and returned after the building is complete. And just across the board, absolute minimum soil and site disturbance. Again, any soil penetration that may be required for providing system trenching for electrical routing shall be done with minimal soil disturbance. And again, any displaced soils should be temporary, recovered, and returned after the project is done. No concrete or asphalt in the mounting area. You need to address any existing soil and water resource concerns that may be impact, limited use of geotextile fabrics, and where not practical, to also use the area for agricultural production to maintain vegetative cover to prevent soil erosion. The additional on-bill crediting option that I've discussed previously is the alternative to net metering that we are proposing. So today, the vast majority of solar facilities are compensated for energy that's exported to the grid through a net metering credit. The stakeholders that we convened last year and throughout the fall we had a lot of extensive discussion regarding developing another option for solar generators. The option would function in a manner similar to net metering, but would only be available to participants in the SMART program. Since it is technically an energy tariff, it's not a part of the DOER reg, but would be established at the same time that the SMART tariff is approved by the DPU. And the compensation rate for the exported energy would likely be set at a basic service rate, although that still has to be determined in the DPU process. There are a lot of benefits for this additional on-bill credit. It's a single rate for all facilities. It would allow for credits to be transferred to off-takers without net metering, so there's no cap. So projects that are seeking to apply for an off-taker-based adder, if they're in a territory where the net metering cap has been hit, they can utilize this additional on-bill credit to still offer credits and allocate energy credits to various off-takers and be community solar, be low income. There wouldn't be any single parcel rule. There'd be no 10 megawatt public entity cap. The cap on the number of credits that can be transferred to an off-taker based adder based on an off-taker's, there may be a cap on the number of credits that can be transferred to off-takers, but there's still the potential for fewer limitations on the number of times off-takers can be changed or reallocated within a year. There really is an opportunity for streamlining the administrative aspects of the credit transfers through this on-bill credit. But again, all details for this additional on-bill credit are subject to approval by the DPU. So I just want to go over some system type definitions. So if you're familiar with the system type definitions we currently have for SREC 2, you'll recognize the definition for landfills, brownfields, building mounted, and low-income properties. We are going to slightly modify the definition for solar canopies, and we're adding definitions for low-income residential, low-income community shared solar, public facilities, and energy storage. So we are adjusting the definition for solar canopy units, and that we are adding the addition of canopies installed in agricultural land, and also for canopies to be installed over canals. The eligibility of canopy sited on agricultural land will be determined in consultation with Massachusetts DOER. The intent of allowing and adding this additional definition to solar canopy is really to allow for dual use unit. So it's not sort of your what would be a parking canopy installed on ag land, but rather a solar generation unit installed on active agricultural land in such a way that you can still utilize the land for growing crops or hay or feeding livestock or something. So it's still active land that also has an active solar PV system installed on it. We're going to maintain the criteria for low-income facilities that serve low-income properties. And then we're also going to provide additional support for projects that directly serve low-income residents. We're going to do this in two ways. So projects 25 kW or less that directly serve R2 or a low-income class utility customer will be eligible for a higher base incentive rate, as I discussed earlier. And we also will have a specific low-income community shared solar adder. So if you have a community shared solar project that serves at least 50%, with its offtake at least 50% on an R2 rate, so again, that low-income utility class rate, they'll receive a higher level incentive than the regular community shared solar projects. We're also adding a definition for public projects. The definition for a public entity generation unit will be a system sited on property that's owned by any public entity. So it's either owned or operated by a city or town or other governmental entity, or it has assigned 100% of its output to a public entity. So the project has to be on public land, and all of its power has to go to a public off-taker. the definition tracks closely with the definition of a net metering facility of a public entity, but just differs slightly in that it requires facilities to also be sited on public land in addition to have public off-takers. And energy storage. So one of the new things that we are introducing for the SMART program is the solar plus storage adder. The original straw proposal that we proposed in September distinguished between standalone and behind the meter storage facilities, but now after a lot of research, we're going to have a single adder that's a variable adder. And it's based primarily on the ratio of the storage capacity to the solar capacity and the duration of the storage. So I'll show you in a second the very complicated formula we have for determining what the value of the adder is, but it's based on a base adder of 4.5 cents, and it's designed to provide more value to higher capacity and longer duration storage. And the adder, like the other adders, will decrease by 4% per block, so that 4.5 cent base adder will be decreasing by 4%. And facilities smaller than 25 kW will also be able to receive a storage adder. They are not eligible to receive any other type of adder, but they can get storage. And then as we're continuing to develop our storage programs in the state, there is a possibility for projects to receive alternative energy certificates. So if they are approved at some future time to produce AICs for storage and for batteries, then that would also be transferred to the distribution companies. Pairing solar plus storage provides a lot of benefits to the electric grid. It improves power quality support. It allows for rapid ramping to reduce intermittency. It allows for energy generation to be shifted to reduce peak demand. And it reduces the strain on the distribution system during times of minimum load and high PV output. So kind of your classic middle of the day during it's really sunny, have a lot of PV, but you're not at a peak. So the adder is structured to realize these benefits in ways that are consistent with our state of charge report. And like I was saying, it provides greater value to projects with a higher storage capacity and longer duration. So this is the formula for determining what an energy storage adder will be. I'll move to the next slide so you can see what the actual outputs are, but as you can see, it is a non-linear formula based on multiple variables. And this is what the actual adder would be for projects based on the percentage of the battery to the PV and also the number of hours for the storage. So we're looking at a minimum of a battery size that's 25% of the PV installation, and it has to run for at least 2 hours. So we're saying we have minimum and maximum nominal rated power. So the system has to be at least 25% of the PV system that it's paired with, and it will be incentivized for no more than 100% of the rated capacity. So if you feel like it, you can build a battery that's over 100% the size of your PV system, but we're not going to pay you for it. We'll also have a minimum and maximum nominal useful energy. So it has to run for at least 2 hours, but it's also that will cap out at 6 hours. So if you have a battery that can operate for more than 6 hours, you won't receive any more than the maximum that you would receive under 6 hours. The minimum efficiency requirements, it has to have at least a 65% round trip efficiency in normal operation. And also, we are going to have a data requirement. So you have to provide historical 15-minute interval performance data to the administrator for the first year of the program, and also upon request for the first 5 years of operation. And then the system must also discharge at least 52 complete cycle equivalents per year and must remain functional and operational in order for the PV unit to continue to be eligible for the energy storage adder. So just going over the qualification process for systems under the SMART program. systems will submit an application to the Solar Program Administrator. You can submit an application before interconnection to reserve capacity within a block, but you will be required to provide additional documentation. For projects 25 kW and under, you have to submit an executed turnkey contract between the installer and the customer. And for projects over 25 kW, you have to submit an executed ISA, proof of site control, and non-ministerial permits, which is the same criteria for obtaining a cap allocation for net metering through Mass ACA, and also it's the same criteria that we had established under the original SREC 2 assurance of qualification process. And then in order to remain qualified and to begin receiving compensation, a project must submit a copy of its authorization to interconnect by the end of its block reservation period, which will be a year. So other than the initial competitive procurement, which will be kind of a one-time special thing, reservations will be provided on a first-come, first-served basis. So we'll give applicants an opportunity to hold their position for if they have an issue with their application for a defined period of time. We'll offer a cure period. And then the initial reservation periods will be 12 months, but we will have a number of extensions. We'll offer an indefinite extension for mechanical completion. So if the project is built after 12 months, but you just haven't received the authorization to interconnect from the utility company, you'll retain your reservation and the space in that block. We will offer a 6-month extension for pending legal challenges. We'll offer a one-time 6-month extension for a fee, and we'll still have our good cause exception, which will be done on a case-by-case basis. So if a project doesn't meet its required deadlines, its reserve capacity will be added to the block that's currently open, and projects that trigger a new block will receive a blended rate. So just going over metering and reporting, all projects will have a utility meter and a production meter. Both will be owned by the utility company, and they will be reporting production and the utility meter data to the program administrator. We'll develop technical requirements, but likely those will mirror existing standards, and we'll establish a process to ensure that the production meter can be accessed by the system owner as well. So they may choose to own a redundant production meter, or we may require DAS or data acquisition system providers for all systems. Class 1 REC ownership. So the payments under this program are for Class 1 RECs. So the utilities are paying a system owner the incentive amount that they will receive, and in return, they will get the rights to the RECs generated by that project. So distribution companies will have to have their own NEPL GIS accounts and register the facilities. And then they will retain asset ownership as long as the facility is eligible to receive payment for the RECs under the SMART program. Following the project's eligibility period after 10 or 20 years, the rights go back to the project owner. So just kind of an overview of the processes coming up. We will start with the DOER emergency rulemaking, and that will be when we file the emergency regulation, and that will contain program eligibility criteria, incentive values, block sizes, qualifications, and metering requirements. And then after we finish the promulgation of our regs, the DPU process will begin. And that process will cover cost recovery for distribution companies and also the approval of the alternative on-bill crediting mechanism. So for those familiar with the process that created net metering, it's loosely modeled on that, in that the rates are specified in statute and regulation, and the cost recovery is approved by the DPU. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, municipal light plants are not investor-owned utility companies, so they cannot participate in the SMART program, but we've had several meetings with them, and I think we are working on developing a voluntary program for them. So as soon as we have more information about that, we will get that out to stakeholders. So the next steps are that we are going to file the emergency reg as quickly as possible. Once we file, it's in effect immediately. We have 90 days to go through the formal regulation process. So we'll have a comment period and a public hearing. And then after that, 3 processes would need to take place following the filing of the reg. So the distribution companies will have to issue the RFP for the program administrator. They'll have to issue either a joint or individual RFPs for the initial competitive procurement for the initial 100 megawatts of projects. And then they'll also have to file for the approval of the program and cost recovery with the DPU. So once they file at the DPU, that will trigger the start of their proceeding. And then the DPU will set a schedule for hearings, testimony, etc. And then once DPU approves the program structure, the program is effective. So we released our final program design in January. At this point, we are likely to file the emergency reg in mid-May, and that will begin that 90-day period. So 90 days following mid-May takes us into July. That's when we would promulgate the final reg, which brings us into August for filing the tariffs with the DPU and issuing the competitive procurement, looking to probably late September, October for the competitive procurement results and establishing the base compensation rates. And then the DPU process will likely be finished sometime in spring of 2018, and the program is in effect. So because it's taking us a little bit longer to get this program up and running because it's a little complicated, we did approve an extension of the SREC 2 program until the start of the next program. So currently projects that are over 25 kW that are mechanically complete by March 31st, 2018 will receive a 30% SREC factor reduction across market sectors from the original SREC factors. And then if the SMART program is not in effect by March 31st, 2018, and systems don't achieve mechanical completion by that date, they'll receive a further reduced SREC factor. So again, as I said, we hope to file the emergency reg sometime in mid-May, and following that, we will be establishing the dates for the public hearings and the deadline for the written comment period. And that's it. Thank you.
Hey, Kaitlin, that's amazing. That's a lot of stuff to go through, and you did it probably as quickly as possible without losing any of the details in there. And I'll tell everybody on the line that you should know that there will be a test at the end of the hour to see if you've memorized all that. But actually, we have an unusual number of questions have come in. So okay. I think we will probably run over about 10 minutes past the hour to get in at least a good number of the questions. The first one is, how are you going to monitor the land use performance standards? How are you going to know if people, meet your requirements related to soil or concrete or anything else like that?
Well, for projects that are looking to qualify as dual-use agricultural projects, they will actually, they'll be required to submit some sort of design and criteria to DOER. So they will certainly have oversight of those specific projects. But for the other land use, I mean, I think in terms of figuring out what the subtractor will be, we'll just look at the project size. I mean, I think we'll have projects tell us this information, but we'll establish some sort of auditing system that the third-party administrator will be able to enact to essentially spot check projects to make sure that they're telling the truth when they give us the land use details.
Okay. And how will the greenfield subtractor be calculated? What goes into setting that value?
So the value is set if you look at the greenfield subtractor page, we have a half greenfield subtractor and a full greenfield subtractor. So it's 0.0005 subtractor per kilowatt hour of production. So kind of if you take a 15-cent base incentive rate, then you subtract that because your base incentive is also per kilowatt hour of production. And then if you have the full greenfield subtractor, it's a 0.001 cent subtractor. So that's how those values are set. And we'll be looking at how the land is zoned and how it's currently developed in order to assess what value subtractor should be assigned to a project, if any.
Okay. There were several questions that came in that had to do with the plan for reduced prices over time. And basically, people were saying, in fact, it's hard to predict the future. The cost of PV may not go down by 4% every year. Or, is there going to be some provision for modifying or adjusting your planned future prices if prices in the marketplace are going down faster or slower than you anticipate?
We may include some sort of provision where, maybe halfway through the program, we do an assessment of where we are, how quickly has development proceeded quickly, has it slowed down, kind of just doing an assessment halfway through to see where we stand. I don't know if we'll do an exact comparison or have exact triggers tied to market prices, but we'll certainly have an assessment of the program.
Okay. And is the incentive ultimately recovered from ratepayers? Do the incentives get recovered proportionally from the rate classes that receive the incentives?
The incentive is recovered from ratepayers. I don't know if it's recovered proportionally across the classes that receive the incentives. That is a little bit in the weedy details of what the DPU proceeding will be, but that's the purpose of having the DPU process, is that the utilities will be approved for cost recovery for the SMART program.
Okay. And why does the program create steps in the size blocks instead of some sort of smooth transition based on size, which, one that doesn't have such distinct blocks?
The declining block design is something that we think is the most cost-effective way to provide support to the solar industry in the state, but also to minimize cost impacts to ratepayers who are, at the end of the day, paying for this program. We did a number of studies over the years that determined that this model of incentive program was really the most cost-effective way to do so.
Okay. And we got some questions on things that you covered because there was a lot there, folks want you to go over some of the same ground again. And this has to do with the issue of the relationship between this program and net metering, and whether it's an alternative or whether it's a successor. You seem to imply that somebody can continue to participate in net metering and still participate in this program.
Right. This is not a successor to net metering. This is an alternative to net metering. The reason that we're proposing this is because DOER has no jurisdiction over the net metering program in the state, and the caps can only be raised by the legislature. So those are two bodies that we really have no power over. What we wanted was to create a mechanism for projects to do community solar, for projects to be low-income property generation units, and to be able to allocate those on-bill energy credits to a number of off-takers outside of the net metering construct. So net metering, we don't know what's going to happen with net metering. Anything could happen with it in the next year or so and in the future, but that has to be determined over at the legislature. We just wanted to make sure that projects had a way of moving forward even if net metering caps were hit.
And In terms of alternatives, you said under this program that the RECs will go to the utilities. What happens if there's a system owner who wants to be able to claim that they are getting the renewable electricity from their system and therefore they would like to retain the RECs? Are they completely out?
They have a number of options. If they wanted to be able to match the power that's being generated by their program, they could procure RECs on their own, or they could simply register as a Class 1 facility in Massachusetts. So they would be generating the RECs and be able to do whatever they wanted with them. So they wouldn't be able to participate in the SMART program, but they would still be able to participate as a Class 1 facility and just qualify simply as a Class 1 and not as a SMART system.
One person wanted to make sure they understood something about the auction process and the initial competitive procurement, and that is, this person was assuming it was going to be a reverse auction. Is that correct?
So it's set by a clearing price. So essentially, each of the utilities will procure a certain amount, adding up to 100 megawatts in total. In each utility service territory, projects that are responding to that particular service territory's procurement, you essentially take the bids and you stack them up from lowest to highest. So say National Grid has 45 megawatts open for procurement. You take all the bids, stack them lowest to highest, count up for 45 megawatts. That last megawatt that gets in sets the price for all of those projects in that utility service territory. So that's just for the procurement. What we're saying is that to set the average base compensation rate for the state, it's the final rates across each utility service territory, and you take the weighted average of them, and that's what you use against the indices to set all the rest of the rates.
Okay, that does clear it up. That's good. And are the utilities allowed to be bidders?
No.
And how about the issue of a solar project at a multifamily site? Let's imagine that this site production allocation is split between the property and the tenants. Could it qualify for the community shared solar adder?
Yeah, it could if there are at least 3 unique tenants. And as long as it's not under 25 kW or less.
Okay. And you mentioned that bids in the first 100 megawatts may or may not allow bids that include adders. Do you have a sense of how soon we'll know that?
When we file the regs.
Okay, so pretty soon. Let me keep looking through the questions here to see what else we have. Somebody wants to know about the solar plus storage system. Has several questions about it. What's the goal in offering an adder for solar plus storage systems? How are the storage systems expected to operate? And can it be any type of energy storage, or does it have to be a specific type like electrochemical or thermal?
It can be any type of energy storage. It does have to be tied to the PV system, since the way that the compensation will be calculated for solar plus storage will be determined based on the PV output. So we determine whatever adder you get on top of your base compensation rate for the PV system, and then if you have storage attached to it. And then based on the PV production, that's how your total amount and total value will be calculated. And the intent is really to we wanted to begin to provide incentives for storage in Massachusetts. We have broader storage goals. As I mentioned, we issued our state of charge report. So really the solar plus storage under the SMART program is just the first step in a number of planned programs that the state will be unveiling for storage incentives.
I have a few more questions I will be asking, but while I ask the next question, Sam, could you put up slide 10, which will be not for this question, but for the question after. One of the people listening to the webinar wants to know why you're using a 3-year average of distribution, transmission, and transition charges instead of just the current rate at the time the incentive is set.
We're using the 3-year average because, well, we can't use the current rate because there's seasonal variations in basic service. It changes every 6 months. So to really get a true average, I don't know why we picked 3 years, but really just we wanted to get a true average of what the rates were for that rate class in that project.
Okay, so let's look at slide 10 at the moment. A couple people asked about this and they wanted to know, could a project qualify for more than one adder in a category? In other words, if they do a solar canopy on a brownfield, can they qualify for both of those?
So at the moment we're allowing eligibility to qualify for one adder per category. So you want to be able to do a brownfield solar canopy, but you could do a public solar canopy or a public landfill.
Yes, okay. And that makes perfect sense. And will block allotments be recalculated over time?
In terms of the size? I'm not sure I understand that question.
Okay, well, let's pass it on. I'm
Okay.
just reading the questions, and that doesn't mean I understand anything. Somebody wants to know, what makes this an emergency regulation? Why is it called an emergency regulation?
So an emergency regulation, it has to be, essentially for an emergency to be able to be filed, a regulation to be filed as an emergency reg, it has to meet an immediate need. So part of the reason we're doing this is because the solar bill that prompted us to create this new program was passed a year ago. That bill actually had an emergency preamble on it. And I think we just want to get this done as quickly as possible, and because we just have a number of steps to achieve before the program is really fully in effect. So by passing it as an emergency reg, we'll still go through the full public process. But for example, since it'll be in effect immediately, we can really work closely with the utilities at the time in developing the administrator RFP and developing the RFP for the procurement.
Here's another one where I maybe didn't pick up exactly what you were saying, and maybe this questioner doesn't have this right, but the questioner said you seem to be implying that small projects would be assisted for 10 years and large projects for 20 years. If that's the case, why the difference?
Yes, that is the case. So small projects, 25 kW or less, will receive a 10-year payment, and then over 25 kW projects will receive a 20-year payment. So I think this really was, for most residential size projects, and installers, owners are looking for a faster rate of return than 20 years. They're just, financing them is different. So having a 10-year term makes more sense for smaller projects than for the larger projects, which often have the 20-year terms.
Okay, and one of the folks on the line wants to know how your 4% reduction is being between blocks is being calculated. In other words, is block 3 4% less than block 2, or is it that block 3 is 8% less than block 1?
No, it's per block. So block 2 is 4% less than block 1. Block 3 is 4% than 4% less than block 2, etc.
If a block doesn't fill, is there a mechanism to adjust the block value?
At the moment, a block will remain open until it's filled. I think if we see that a block remains open for a significant period of time, then when we have kind of our mid-program assessment, that may be something we can address at that time. But currently, there's no mechanism to adjust the rates.
And could you explain how you're defining previously developed land?
Yeah, essentially, if there is any sort of, if there's a building there, if there's been pavement, like things like that, we do have a more specific definition that will be included in the regs when we file them.
We're only going to take a few more questions, but we'll stop at 10 after the hour. Following on the theme of canopies that allows farming, would a canopy definition be considered for a dam reservoir that still allows the use of the dam? As an example, a floating solar project on a reservoir that is on a dam reservoir, whereby the water surface is still used to generate electricity in the case of a hydroelectric dam. Well, that's
currently, yeah,
currently
no. Currently, it would just be if you actually have a canopy over a canal, or if you have canopy on ag land.
Somebody wants you to clarify public projects. Do they both have to be on municipal or government property and with 100% of the power going to the public entity? How about if a private property owner installed solar with 100% of the power going to a public off-taker? Would that qualify as a public project?
That would not qualify as a public project for the public adder. It would only qualify for the public adder if it's on public land and 100% of the power is going to a public entity.
Okay. What's the process for DPU approval, and has that dialogue begun?
So it's the cost recovery process at the DPU. So basically, the electric distribution companies will file tariffs at the DPU, and then the DPU will establish a schedule. So it's like any other DPU process for cost recovery for approval of a tariff.
And are the existing systems that participated in the SREC 1 and SREC 2 programs grandfathered, and they will continue to get their incentives under those programs?
So if a project is currently qualified for the SREC 2 program, then they will just continue to receive SRECs until their SREC term expires.
Well, I think we should end this here. I'll give you another minute to say anything else you would like to say that you haven't gotten a chance to say, but we could go on for quite some time with the large number of questions here, but you've been heroic in both going through this detailed presentation and responding to a large number of questions already, and I'm sure in the coming months there will be opportunities for folks to learn more about this program. Is there anything else you want to say to folks before we close?
No, I would just say, keep an eye out next month for notice for when we file the emergency regs. And then at that time, we will be open to public comments, and we will also be sending out details about the public hearing or hearings that we'll be hosting. So I would just have people keep an eye out. We'll be providing more information as soon as possible.
Well, we will do that, and I want to thank you very much, Kaitlin, for an excellent presentation today, and I hope those of you on the line will be back for more webinars from the RPS Collaborative and from the Clean Energy States Alliance. Thank you all.